If you were going to change the world, to start a movement that would outlast empires and reshape history, who would you hire? You'd look for the elite, the scholars with the highest degrees, the influencers with the most followers, the wealthy with the deepest pockets. You would look for the winners. But 2,000 years ago, a young rabbi from a backwater town did the exact opposite. He walked past the universities, he ignored the palaces, and he headed straight for the docks and the tax booths. He didn't just stumble upon his team, he strategically hunted for the people the world had already written off. He chose the failures. And today we're gonna look at the psychological underdog strategy that explains why your greatest weakness is actually your secret weapon. Let's start with the face of the group, Peter. We see him in art as a saint in golden robes, but the historical reality is much more rugged. Peter and his brother Andrew were fishermen in Galilee. In first century Israel, being a fisherman meant one thing: you had failed the educational cut. In that culture, every young boy went to school to study the Torah. The brightest students, the 1%, were invited to continue their studies with a rabbi. The rest? They were sent home to learn the family trade. Peter was a dropout. He was a man who had been told by his teachers and his society that he wasn't smart enough for spiritual things. He was a man of manual labor and impulsive mistakes. But if Peter was an academic failure, the next man on the list was a moral failure: Matthew. In the eyes of the Jewish people, Matthew wasn't just a sinner, he was a traitor. As a tax collector for the Roman Empire, he was a man who had sold out his own people for profit. He sat in a booth in Capernaum, protected by Roman spears, taking money from his neighbors to fund the army that oppressed them. He was wealthy, but he was hated. He was the one person no respectable religious leader would ever be seen with. Yet Jesus didn't just talk to him, he invited him into his inner circle. Why? Why choose a man whose very presence would make the good people stay away? This is where the strategy gets deep. There's a psychological concept called the clean slate effect. Jesus knew that the religious elite of his day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, were already full. They were full of their own opinions, their own pride, and their own systems. You can't pour new wine into old wineskins. Jesus didn't want the people who thought they were arrived. He wanted the people who were hungry. He chose the fishermen because they had the grit to endure a storm. He chose the tax collector because he was a master of details and record keeping, skills that would eventually allow Matthew to write the very gospel we read today. But there is a reason this matters to you right now in 2026. Many of us feel like we've missed our window. We feel like our past mistakes, our lack of a degree, or our social standing has disqualified us from doing something great. We look at the winners on social media and feel like the ultimate underdogs. But the underdog strategy of Jesus proves one thing: your value isn't based on your current status, but on your future potential in the hands of the right leader. Jesus wasn't looking for a finished product, he was looking for raw material. However, choosing the failures was the easy part, managing them was the nightmare. In our next section, we're gonna look at the inner circle chaos. How do you take a group of dropouts, traitors, and political radicals, people who literally hated each other, and turn them into a team that would eventually take down the Roman Empire? Because the biggest battle wasn't against the world, it was against the failures within themselves. Picking a team of failures is a bold move, but making them work together, that's where the underdog strategy nearly falls apart. Imagine the tension at the dinner table. On one side, you have Matthew the tax collector, a man who spent years getting rich by taking money from his own people to give to the Roman occupiers. On the other side, you have Simon the zealot. In the first century, a zealot wasn't just a religious person, they were political assassins. Their goal was the violent overthrow of Rome. Simon's old job was literally to hunt down and eliminate people exactly like Matthew. In any other world, these two would have killed each other on sight. Yet Jesus forced them to share the same bread. He didn't just choose failures, he chose enemies. He was building a team out of the very people society said could never belong together. But the conflict wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. These men were rugged, unrefined, and incredibly competitive. We often think of the disciples as quiet, holy men walking in silence. But the Bible paints a much noisier picture. On the road to Capernaum, they got into a heated argument. What were they fighting about? They were arguing over which of them was the greatest. Here they were, a group of dropouts and outcasts, and their egos were already taking over. They were obsessed with the hierarchy. This is a psychological reality we see even today. When people feel like they've been chosen, their first instinct is often to look down on others. They were turning the underdog strategy into a power struggle. To understand why this was so chaotic, you have to realize that these men were breaking 1,000 years of tradition. Usually a student would follow a rabbi to become like the rabbi, to learn his rules and his yoke. But Jesus' yoke was different. He told them, "The greatest among you must be the servant of all." This was a total system shock. In the Roman world, greatness was measured by how many people served you. Jesus was flipping the script. He was teaching these failures that their value didn't come from their rank, but from their willingness to stoop lower than anyone else. He was stripping away their old identities, the fisherman, the tax collector, the assassin, to give them a new identity that didn't rely on their past mistakes or their political anger. Then came the literal storms. There is a famous moment on the Sea of Galilee where the wind and waves are threatening to sink the boat. Peter and the other fishermen, men who had spent their entire lives on this water, were terrified. This is a key part of the underdog strategy. Jesus often led his team into situations where their natural skills were useless. Peter couldn't fish his way out of a hurricane. Matthew couldn't buy his way out of a storm. They had to reach a point of total helplessness to realize that their own strength wasn't enough. They were failures not because they lacked talent, but because they were trying to do a supernatural job with purely natural tools. The fear they felt in that boat was the final stage of their unlearning. Before they could lead, they had to learn how to follow in total darkness. If you feel like your life is in chaos right now, if you feel like the people around you don't understand you, or you're fighting an internal battle between who you were and who you want to be, realize that this friction is part of the process. Jesus didn't call the disciples because they were peaceful. He called them to make them peaceful. The chaos you're experiencing isn't a sign that you failed. It's a sign that the underdog strategy is working. Your ego is being stripped away so that something stronger can be built in its place. But the greatest test was still to come. It's easy to follow a leader when the crowds are cheering. It's easy to feel like an underdog on the rise when miracles are happening. But what happens when the leader is arrested? What happens when the movement looks like it's completely died? In our final section, we look at the ultimate pivot. How the greatest failure in history, the cross, became the foundation for the most successful movement the world has ever seen, and more importantly, how that same pivot can change your life today. Every underdog story has a moment where it looks like it's all over. For this team of failures, that moment was a Friday afternoon outside the walls of Jerusalem. The leader they had pinned all their hopes on was gone. The strategy appeared to be a total disaster. Peter, the man who promised to stay to the end, had denied he even knew Jesus. The rest had scattered into the shadows. In the eyes of the world, they weren't just failures anymore. They were jokes. They had left their nets and their booths for a man who ended up on a Roman cross. At that moment, the underdog strategy didn't look like a masterstroke of genius. It looked like a cautionary tale about following the wrong person. But then, something happened that defied every law of psychology and history. These men didn't just crawl back to their old lives. Within weeks, these same dropouts, cowards, and tax collectors emerged from hiding. But they weren't the same. The failure of the cross hadn't crushed them. It had finished the work of emptying them. They no longer cared about who was the greatest. They no longer cared about their reputations or their political anger. They had seen the impossible. They had seen their leader overcome death itself. Suddenly, their unqualified status became their greatest credential. They weren't powerful men trying to be holy. They were broken men who had been made whole. And that kind of conviction is the most dangerous force on earth. Look at the historical data. Within 300 years, the movement started by these 12 failures had peacefully conquered the very empire that tried to execute them. How? Because Jesus knew a secret that modern corporations and leaders often miss. A person who has been forgiven much loves much. A person who has been picked up from the bottom will go further than the person who was born at the top. This is the underdog paradox. works. By choosing the unqualified, Jesus ensured that the power of the message was never about the messenger. When Peter spoke, people didn't see an academic, they saw a miracle. When Matthew wrote, they didn't see a traitor, they saw a transformation. The strategy worked because the failure of the men proved the power of the message. Now, look at your own life. Perhaps you've been watching this because you feel like a failure in your own story. Maybe you're the dropout of your family, the one who made the big mistake, or the one who feels invisible in a world obsessed with winners. If that's you, I want you to realize something. You are exactly the kind of person Jesus is looking for. The underdog strategy hasn't changed in 2,000 years. He doesn't need your perfection, he needs your permission. He doesn't need your credentials, he needs your character. Your past doesn't disqualify you, it prepares you. The very things you try to hide, your scars, your regrets, your failed seasons, are the exact things he wants to use to show the world what true transformation looks like. The 12 failures changed the world not because they became perfect, but because they stayed connected. They realized that being an underdog isn't a permanent condition, it's a setup for a comeback. So the next time you feel unqualified, remember the fisherman who led a movement, remember the tax collector who wrote a gospel, and remember that the same leader who chose them is looking at you today, asking the same question. Will you follow me? If this perspective changed the way you see your own struggles, hit the subscribe button and join our community of underdogs. We're diving deep into the psychological and historical truths of the Bible every week to help you find your purpose in the chaos. And if you're feeling tired or overwhelmed right now, watch this video next on why everyone is so exhausted and the ancient secret to true rest.